So it's been a wild ride. The Canon R5 is possibly one of the most controversial camera releases that we've seen in quite some time. Possibly the most controversial camera release that I've seen in a while, maybe since the EOS R, but there's definitely been a lot more discussion and controversy thrown at these releases from Canon. And it didn't start when they released the cameras. This all started when we started hearing murmurs about rumors of an 8K camera coming from Canon. Canon rumors started displaying the rumored specs of this camera. We saw things like uncropped 8K, uncropped 4K 120, 40 megapixel sensors, 45 megapixel sensors. I think there was at a point like a 75 or 80 megapixel camera coming. And then there was word that this new IBIS system from Canon was coming out, and they've been working really hard on it, and they're going to infuse the IBIS with the OIS with digital IS to create some like super hybrid IBIS system. And I'll never forget when the rumors were posted by Canon Rumors and they were accused of lying, and there was a lot of weird discussion and comments around these specs. No way Canon would release a 4K uncropped camera up to 120 with 10-bit internal because it's gonna eat into their cinema line. Well, as time went on, it did become real, and the Canon R5 was released alongside the R6, and everyone in the camera community lost their collective minds.
It's finally happening.
What?
The mythical unicorn is almost here.
Okay, take my money now.
I'm not buying that it's gonna be this good.
So I think momentum has shifted back to Canon.
क्योंकि Canon ने एक बहुत खतरनाक एटम बम फोड़ दिया.
No way, there's just no way.
The dream has come true.
This is the camera to beat for 2020, hands down.
This was the perfect hybrid camera. We all were very, very excited when these cameras were announced until Peter McKinnon dropped his video on the R5, and along about halfway through the video dropped one of the most wretched words in the camera world: overheating.
There were some quirks and things to it that I think will be ironed out when the launch version comes, and there was also a couple things that I was unsure of. Example, if you're shooting a lot of 4K 120, sometimes the camera starts to overheat, and it gives you that overheat warning just so that the things inside don't melt and it doesn't get destroyed.
Yes, that's right. Are these cameras plagued by overheating? Will we not be able to use these cameras because they will overheat? This is something that Sony users have been dealing with for some time now, and Canon was the light at the end of the tunnel. Are they finally going to release a camera that offered great video specs as well as great photo specs that didn't overheat? Unfortunately, the camera was too good to be true, and as more and more reviews came in, the overheating problem became more prevalent. Now, these overheating claims really clouded the camera's release, making it a much more negative consensus on the camera than a positive one, and it dominated the conversation. It dominated over all the other great aspects that this camera provided because it was such an Achilles heel. But now I'm here with my full Canon R5 review. I have a very storied history with this camera, and it's been such an amazing camera to use in the past few weeks. And I'm just gonna give my full thoughts on this camera, on how I have been using it and how this camera specific to me fits into my type of content creation and my type of workflow. So let's get into the review. I'm jumping into specs first. The price, $3,900 for a 45 megapixel full frame CMOS sensor using the new Digic X processor. It claims up to 8 stops of IBIS. You're gonna get the dual pixel autofocus that now includes animal eye autofocus, and it works in all modes, all photography modes and all video modes. For photography, you're getting a 12 frames per second mechanical shutter with a 20 frames per second electronic shutter. It does shoot silently. You're getting the fully articulating display. You're getting a 5.76 million dot OLED viewfinder, and that goes up to 120 frames per second. It comes with a 5 gigahertz and 2.4 gigahertz Wi-Fi chip, as well as Bluetooth 4.2 for connectivity. It comes with a CFast Express Type B slot with a UHS 2 SD card slot. You're gonna get a 3.5 millimeter mic jack as well as a headphone jack, and it does come with a micro HDMI port. I believe it's 2.0 spec, but I'm not 100% on that. It does come with USB-C 3.1 Gen 2 power delivery port on the side. They removed the swipe bar from the EOS R and replaced it with a common joystick. Now, a link down in the description shows you all of the recording video modes as well as their bit rates. So if you wanted to take a look at that, make sure you click the link down in the description. All right, so running through the specs, we can see that Canon has really thrown the kitchen sink at this camera. Rather than just giving us 4K 24, 4K 30 uncropped, which I would have been happy with, and I'll get to that, But rather than just doing that, they decided, let's push it a little bit. Let's give it the 4K 60, let's give it 4K 120, and fuck it, let's give it 8K RAW. I'd much rather have them throw those modes in a limited fashion than not have those modes at all. That's just me. I rather more value for my money. The next thing I want to get into is handling and ergonomics. How this camera handles, how it feels, how it shoots. Again, this is something that was lacking in the Sony system. It just never felt like a Canon. It never felt like a Nikon. The Canon EOS R, just when you put it in your hands, it just feels like home. It's nice and smooth around the corners. It forms in your hand. The R5 is no exception to that. It feels excellent. The grip feels great. It's nice and chunky. It's not too heavy, but it's not too light, so you're not gonna get much of that like micro jittering effect. Of course, you have the flip screen. Now they removed that stupid fucking multi-bar thing and they replaced it with a joystick that works much better. You also have that great wheel on the back that's similar to what's in the 5Ds. I have no qualms with the handling and ergonomics of this camera. It's not as fun and as like meticulous as like a Fuji, but if you're just someone that just needs a great tool that holds in your hand really well, I mean, Canon is known for that basically. They've also done a few other like minor things, like they added a little notch to the on-off button. They allowed the grip port to go inside the battery thing, so you can actually have a much better weather sealing when you add the grip to it. Now, I will say I am disappointed there isn't much more metal on this camera. I think that would help alleviating a lot of the heat and dissipating a lot of the heat. And also the micro HDMI port. I mean, in my opinion, that's the biggest crime that Canon has committed. Removing the mini HDMI port, which isn't the best, but it's far better than the micro HDMI port. Removing that and adding the micro HDMI port, I don't know if I'll ever forgive Canon for that. Completely unacceptable, and if this camera didn't have all of the crazy specs that it does, I probably wouldn't have gotten this just because of that one simple thing. Canon, if you're listening, never do anything like that again. Next, I want to touch on photography. I don't have the most demanding photography workflow. My photography is mostly done here in the studio. It's mostly done travel. It's a lot more of a slower paced photography. I don't do any sports. I don't do any wildlife. I don't do any like fast paced, intense photography. If you're looking for a review like that, you're not gonna get it here. But for someone that does take photography and takes it very seriously, this camera is possibly the best photography camera that I've used. This was my main photography camera here, the A7R3. I did not pick up the R4, and it actually is very comparable, especially with the same, I think the R3 has a 45 megapixel sensor. Nonetheless, this camera is just, the photography on it is just absolutely insane. The 45 megapixel sensor produces like extremely tack sharp images, but not just that. There's also seems to be a nice bump in dynamic range, at least from the A7R3. It also seems to resolve noise so much better than the R and the R3. It just, when you shoot at higher ISOs, it really does crush that noise, and it just produces a much cleaner, usable image at those higher ISO levels, at those more low light levels. Like I said, I'm not a high speed photography shooter, but I did want to test out that 20 frames per second electronic shutter, and it's excellent having that. It's so like snappy, like you can just kind of flick the shutter button and you've already got like 7 images lined up. I don't know that workflow too well, but I've had a blast using it, and I probably will use that a little bit more often. And for me, 12 frames per second is plenty, so I'll probably use that mechanical shutter a little bit more often, just because it does reduce that rolling shutter a little bit more. But that addition of the CFast Express card with the 45 megapixels RAW, you can just let that thing fucking fly, and it's not gonna buffer, it's not gonna hold up, it's just gonna read right to the card, and you don't have to worry about it. You can fill that card up pretty quickly shooting like that. So I am curious to know what sports shooters or wildlife shooters or any other like high-speed photography shooters will think of this. But in terms of myself, I've just been blown away by the photography of this. The JPEGs right out of this camera are stunning. So if you need to shoot one of these files to your phone through social media and you don't want to do it through the RAW, you just want to go right to JPEG, they look amazing. Just my time with shooting it has just been such a pleasant experience in the photography modes, and that's really the best thing that I can say about it. I have no qualms with it. This is 100% going to be my number one A cam for photography. It's just so good. But let's jump into what I know you all have been waiting for, the video side of the Canon R5. I do want to touch on 1080p. I still think 1080p is very important, And I'm sure many of you want to know how the 1080p is. The 1080p is fine. It's not the best 1080p. It's not going to be 1080p that you're going to get off of something like the 1DX because it does have that massive 45 megapixel sensor. It's just doing a bunch of math inside that kind of really softens that 1080p. It's fine. I don't really have much qualms with it, but what's nice is now you do get the 10-bit internal C-Log in 1080p, which is great. The 1080p doesn't overheat. The 1080p isn't limited in any way. I believe they're going to be adding 120 frames per second in 1080p. I could be wrong. I don't know why they missed out on that. It only goes up to 60 frames per second, which is kind of disappointing. But if you're still a 1080p shooter mainly, you're probably not looking at this camera. If you're going to be doing like super long form content, if you really need to reserve data, you really need to reserve battery life, then the 1080p option is there. It doesn't do 1080p better than the EOS R per se. It doesn't do 1080p better than any other cheaper option. 1080p is just fine. Next, I want to get into the 4K standard mode. There's a few different 4K modes. This is where things start to get a bit interesting. In the 4K standard mode, you get up to 60 frames per second. Now, the full frame standard mode is taking that full frame 8K sensor and it's doing some line skipping and it's doing some binning to produce that 4K image. And if we take that 4K file as it is and we compare it to something like the A7R3 or we compare it to something like the EOS R, the quality is pretty much similar. I would say you're getting a little bit improved in dynamic range, you're getting a little bit more detail, you're just getting a little bit extra data from it. Of course, the introduction of 10-bit C-Log allows you to now just have more color data, so that's going to be an improvement there as well. Now, if you're going to be mainly using this camera without an external recorder, you need to make sure that you are perfectly fine with the 4K standard mode of this camera because this mode does not overheat. You can run it basically indefinitely. You're gonna run into that 30-minute timer. I've been tweeting at Canon every day to remove it, so hopefully they do remove that. I think they've rumored that it's going to be removed. But you need to make sure that if you're thinking about this camera as a hybrid, that you're going to enjoy that 4K option. You're gonna find it perfectly adequate to work with. I personally do. I think the 4K on it looks great. And if we look at my previous video where I made the 4K look like the 4K HQ just by adding a little bit of sharpening, I see no reason to not use this mode 99% of the time. Again, when you're not running it through that external recorder, the 4K mode is great with 10-bit C-Log internal that you can grade beautifully. And on top of that, you're getting that amazing IBIS, you're getting that amazing autofocus, you're getting all of like the amazing things that make up this camera with that 4K option that's no longer cropped. This was what we all wanted from the EOS R, and now it's introduced to us in the R5. And really the question is, do I feel like I'm missing out when I'm using this 4K option? And I do not. I do not feel like I'm missing out using this standard 4K mode, especially now knowing just a little bit of sharpening makes it very similar to the best 4K that I've ever seen. I am perfectly fine with the 4K out of this. And just to prove my point, I'm gonna show you a video where there's 4K HQ and there's 4K standard with a little bit of sharpening. And I'm not gonna tell you what's what. For those who are extremely tuned in, who are extremely technically minded, you might be able to figure out which one it is, but I'm not gonna tell you which one it is because I know most of you aren't gonna be able to tell. And again, it's really just showcasing the point that the 4K standard mode is perfectly adequate. It's not unusable as I heard some other reviewers calling it. I think that's asinine. Of course, when you compare it to 4K HQ or in the 8K options and some other downscaled 4K options, it doesn't look as sharp, but to call it unusable, I think does the camera a huge disservice. Because remember, it wasn't that long ago we wanted a uncropped 4K camera that had IBIS, autofocus, a flip screen, and internal 10-bit, and we got it. We finally got this camera, and now all of a sudden we all want 8K downsampled 4K with all of those features, and we want it to run indefinitely. And I think that's a little disingenuous. Now, I understand wanting to push the industry a bit. I just think it's hilarious that we finally get something like this, and now all of a sudden the 4K is unusable, and it seems like the EOS R all over again. And I guess that's just the insatiability of the camera consumer. Next, we're moving on to the 4K crop mode, and this takes that 8K sensor, crops it to a 5.1K readout, and then it just shoots that out. So you're getting that 4K from a downsampled 5.1K sensor, and it looks great, and you do notice a little jump in detail and clarity because now you are downsampling that 4K. It's not doing any line skipping or doing any pixel binning. It's not as sharp as the downsampled 8K, But I mean, it looks really good. It looks great. Again, what's great about this mode is that this mode also doesn't overheat. So if you want to shoot with any sort of like APS-C lens, or you need to get that extra length out of your lens and you want that extra detail, you can rely on the 4K crop mode up to 30 frames per second to really make sure that you get that shot. I mean, it's 100% reliable. You don't need to worry about it. And really the only way that I like using it is to get that extra length. Because like I said, I can just sharpen that standard 4K, and I like to shoot full frame most of the time. But if I'm going out with the 15 to 35 and I want to get a little bit closer, pop on the crop mode, I get a little bit closer, and I also get that little extra jump in detail. And it's very welcomed. So I don't really expect too many people to be using it, but I could be wrong. I mean, it could be very popular because it does look excellent, and like I said, it doesn't overheat. Now I want to jump into 4K 60, and yeah, 4K 60 and a mirrorless hybrid with IBIS autofocus. It's awesome. Now this mode, it will mainly be used for either those who are shooting sports or shooting some type of event where you want that 60 frames per second image, or those who are going to slow it down to a 30 frames per second, 24 frames per second timeline. I mainly use it to slow down the footage, and I think it looks great. 4K 60 is still doing that line skipped pixel binned image, so you're still going to get that same image that you're going to get out of the 4K standard. Now what's best about this mode that's different about the 4K 120 is that you can resolve this down to 30 frames or 24 frames. It does come with audio, so you don't have to worry about anything like that. It's like going to be a true slowdown. And again, a little bit of sharpening in post makes it look really, really nice and crisp. Unfortunately, this is a mode that overheats. So if you plan to shoot sports, if you plan to shoot events, anything longer than maybe 45 minutes to an hour, I wouldn't count on the 4K 60 unless you're going to shoot externally. When you shoot externally, 4K 60 does not overheat. It will run indefinitely. Now, in my overheating graph, it's pretty reliable that you're going to get around 25 minutes to a half an hour. So if you're shooting intermittently with B-roll, you can pretty much rely on getting that amount of time, which is nice because the 4K 120, we'll talk about that, but it's pretty unreliable. The 4K 60 has been reliable, and I haven't run into overheating issues when I'm shooting B-roll, other than purposely trying to overheat the camera. Now you can shoot in the 4K 60 crop mode, and it does seem to overheat a little bit quicker. Now when you run that 4K 60 crop mode externally, I've gotten up to 2 hours with no overheating warnings whatsoever. I just concluded the test there. So if anyone else wants to add some extra testing data, I think you can get up to like that 4 hour or unlimited mark. So that's 4K 60. I mainly use it for B-roll, and for B-roll, it works great. If you're using it to shoot in 60 frames per second and you're using it to cover events, you're going to need an external recorder. Luckily, if you do have an external recorder, then you're going to get unlimited recording out of it, and you should be able to pretty much run it indefinitely. Now we're going to move on to the 4K 120, and this was rumored, and I didn't believe it. I was like, there's no way this camera's coming with 4K 120, and at the time, I didn't think any camera this size, this market was going to have 4K 120. Alas, here we are. We have 4K 120. Unfortunately, with the R5, this is possibly the most disappointing video mode in the camera, mainly because it resolves it down to a 30 frames per second timeline. You can't resolve it down yourself in post. It just does it for you in camera. It also does it without audio. So it's not like a true 120 frames per second. But what's odd is that it captures the data in a true 120 frames per second. It just doesn't allow you to utilize that data. So I would love to see Canon just give us the 120. Let us capture it in 120 and let us resolve it down ourselves. I'm not sure why they did it this way. I kind of wish that it wasn't this way. Luckily, the IBIS, the autofocus, all that other stuff works in there. It's just unfortunate that that's how they decided to go with it. And the other disappointing thing about it is that it overheats intensely. This is one of the most intense modes on the camera, and it just burns through your overheating buffer. With my testing, I got anywhere from like 10 minutes to 15 minutes of 4K 120, which is fine. I mean, that's perfectly fine. That's plenty for 4K 120. It's just the cumulative use of that 4K 120 burns through that buffer. And I expect to see that fixed in future firmware, but that's what sucks about 4K 120. It's not that you're gonna get 10 to 15 minutes of actual 4K 120. You're gonna get 10 to 15 minutes in the buffer, and anything you do between then is going to eat into that buffer. So I'm shooting 4K 120, I'm getting that B-roll, I take a 3 to 4 second clip, great. I go back to 4K 30 and 4K HQ. Okay, this is great. I go back to 4K 120. Oh shit, it's starting to already eat into my timer, right? And you're not gonna get that full amount of time. So in my chart, I have it as completely unreliable. It's just a novelty feature. Expect maybe a few shots when you go out for a shoot. So for myself, the 4K 120 has been fine, but if you're someone who wants to shoot a lot of 120, if you're someone who needs to go out and rely on getting 120 B-roll, it's just gonna lead you down a path of frustration. So just kind of get it out of your head that you're going to be relying on that mode at all. And there is no external 4K 120. There's no external 8K. It's just that it is what it is. This is definitely a place where if you need that 4K 120, there's other options out there. The Sony a7S III is probably your best bet for that. So next I want to talk about the 4K HQ mode. And this is where they take that big, beautiful 8K sensor, they downsample it down to 4K. And what you're left with is possibly one of the most beautiful 4K images that I've seen come out of a camera. And this is what you're seeing here. It is absolutely gorgeous. It's tack sharp. The motion detail looks great. And of course you can shoot in C-Log, 10-bit 422. You're gonna get it with the IBIS and autofocus. It's just such a joy, such a pleasure to use. Now, unfortunately, with overheating, you're only gonna get about a half an hour internally on the camera before it starts to overheat. And it's a little reliable, it's a little unreliable. So I wouldn't expect to rely on 30 minutes of 4K HQ. You're definitely gonna wanna get an external recorder if you plan to exclusively use 4K HQ. And like I've shown with my testing, I've gotten up to 4 hours with the 4K HQ mode with the external recorder. You just gotta do a few funky things like pop the cards out of the camera and limit your screen on time. And I do want to touch on some of those other video features. So again, you have the 10-bit 422 C-Log file, and it's great. It's fun to work with. Thanks to Gerald Undun's video, we can see that it's a little bit more contrasted than Sony's S-Log 3 in the a7S III, where that's going to produce around 12 to 13 stops. This is going to give you around 11 usable stops of dynamic range. Now, if you don't want to use 10-bit C-Log, you can use the HDR image. There's an HDR PQ option, which is fun to use. There's also a new clarity slider, which seems to add the same sort of clarity that you would use in like a clarity slider in Lightroom. And of course, you have all like those Canon picture profiles, like the standards, the neutrals, all those full contrast picture profiles. Now that's great for anyone who wants to shoot internally and still get a good image out of the camera without having to worry about that H.265 file that comes with 10-bit. So that's something to note. If you are shooting in that C-Log 10-bit, you are basically going to need to make proxies. I'm not aware of any computer currently other than the iPad that can resolve the H.265 file and play it back natively. You have to resolve it into a proxy. But if you're in a pinch and you do need to get some footage out there, you have the option to turn C-Log off. That shoots you into H.264, and then of course it's easy to work with. Again, I just want to highlight the IBIS in this camera. The IBIS is the best IBIS that I've ever used on a camera. I've mainly been using Sony, and Sony's IBIS is just not that good. You can run it at 50 millimeters, 85 millimeters, 105 millimeters, hand hold it. You're gonna get it absolutely steady. The sensor just kind of just lives there. It's a beautiful IBIS system. In my opinion, the IBIS out of the Canon was well worth the wait. They really knocked it out of the park with the IBIS. And I think that's a huge selling point for a lot of creators, myself included. The type of shooting that I do is not necessarily always on a tripod or on a monopod. I'm constantly hand holding these devices. And to me, it's very frustrating getting jittery footage because no matter how sharp it looks, no matter how much dynamic range you have in that image, if it's a little bit jittery, if it's just a little bit shaky, there's no amount of warp stabilization or saving that file. With this IBIS, I haven't had any worries about jitters. I haven't had any worries about any sort of shakiness with the camera. It's so good. It's well worth the price of admission on these cameras. So Canon definitely gets a round of applause for that one. The autofocus is, of course, amazing. It's Canon autofocus. It's always been really good. The eye autofocus is great. The animal eye autofocus is excellent. No problems with that. I love how you can change the tracking. You can change the focus pulling. Now, I like to have my focus pull at around a little bit less than the standard, so it kind of has like a nice transition into the focus, but I love the fact that they allow you to change those options in the camera. And it really does look like a human is focus pulling. It's excellent. I love that feature. If you're using a camera that has like that jumpy, jittery focusing, you're gonna really love the autofocus out of these new Canon cameras because it's pretty fucking smooth. So the totality of all these features on top of that beautiful 4K HQ file is really difficult to not use, and I think that's why we're seeing a lot of sort of disappointment in the R5. It's so good and it's so alluring. Unfortunately, because it's limited internally, it just leaves a kind of sour taste in a lot of people's mouths. So I want to just kind of put a little asterisk next to all of this and say, if you're really thinking about utilizing this camera for video purposes, getting an Atomos Ninja or getting some sort of external recorder opens this camera up to something much more. It really just gives the camera a whole extra outlet to use it in. You're barely getting any limitations on the camera. You can shoot 4K 60 indefinitely. You can shoot 4K HQ up to 4 hours, and those limitations that you get where you're shooting 4K 120, you're shooting 4K 60, you're shooting HQ, you're shooting these modes that start to eat into your buffer, you don't have to worry about that with the external recorder. Now, this is where my review comes in, but for me, because it has all these features in there, I don't mind having to use an external recorder or using another product to get the most out of the camera, to get the full potential out of the camera. To me, I'd much rather have the ability to open up the camera and to get that amazing quality and without any limitations than to not have it. And what I want to stress is that I have here this camera that has great weather sealing, that has IBIS, that has the flip screen, that has all these amazing features, the 10-bit internal, and I can shoot great uncropped full frame 4K right out of the camera. And if I need to really unlock it, I can just add an external recorder, and now I have the best 4K image possible, and I have no limitations on that. And if I want to strip it down even further, then I have an amazing photography stills camera, possibly the best on the market to date. I completely understand the trade-offs that are needed for this type of camera, and I'm willing to pay the price in order to have those features in one body. This camera is solely for those who need a hybrid camera, and a do-it-all camera, a Swiss Army knife of a camera. This is also for those who already have an EOS R, you're looking to upgrade, you have an amazing upgrade path here. I just need to make sure that I note this camera really opens up for video once you add that external recorder. By the way, costs almost as much as a 512 gigabyte CFast Express card. So it's something to think about. You know, that reliability is added, that versatility is added. To me, I love being able to have both of those options in the highest quality in one body. And currently, nothing on the market like this exists. There's just nothing like this currently. So that's basically all I wanted to say about the Canon R5. I've been very happy and very impressed with this camera. For videographers who just want to use this camera without any external recorders, you just want to pick it up and you want to start going, I think you will be disappointed in this camera. And currently, in firmware 1.0, this camera is not for you. I would not recommend this camera. I do not recommend this camera. This camera is for the hybrid all-in-one shooter who's willing to invest in RF mount, who's willing to invest in accessories like an external recorder to get the most potential out of it. But you don't want to have to worry about buying another photography camera. You don't want to worry about buying another photography system. I think that market is pretty big, and from what we've seen with the sales, these have been sold out and back ordered pretty much immediately. I think Canon will have no problem selling these cameras. I'm sure we all want to see these overheating issues kind of put to rest and at least opened up a little bit more. But until then, I'm perfectly happy with the 4K quality that comes in the standard mode. And I'm, again, perfectly happy opening it up with an external recorder to get the best possible image out of it. I'm perfectly fine with that because, of course, you get it all. With all the other features, you get it all. There's nothing that this camera doesn't have. Sure, it has its quirks, sure, it has its limitations, but it does give you the option. It does have the potential to really kind of meet any job, any prospect that you need. You just gotta be willing to kind of pay for it. So, is it the best value camera on the market? Absolutely not. Is it the best videography camera on the market? Absolutely not. I mean, that's gonna go to the A7S III currently. I'm definitely going to get the A7S III. I can't wait for that camera to get here. But it is not the best videography mirrorless camera on the market. What it is the best hybrid camera on the market. There's no questions asked. It's the best hybrid camera on the market. You get the best photography stills camera in Canon's lineup mirrorless to date. And if you're willing to add on a few additions to the camera, like the Atomos Ninja, well, then you do get one of the best mirrorless videography cameras on the market to date. This is definitely a misunderstood camera. Canon is definitely at fault with their marketing. They did a very, very poor job of marketing this camera. I think some reviewers did a very poor job of explaining what this camera can do and focused mainly on what this camera can't do. But ultimately, I think what we're going to see with the R5 is another why I switched to Canon sort of dilemma, where you're gonna see lots of people go, damn it, I really wish I could just have that one camera that did it all. Oh wait, the R5, oh wait, it seems as if it's really not that bad. And then they put up a why I switched to Canon video about a year later. We saw with the EOS R, I was called crazy for picking up that camera when I did. Remember, that camera was deemed unusable, it had an unusable crop in 4K. But we saw with a lot of creators that the camera was absolutely, in fact, usable. And at the time on the market, nothing had that flip screen on it. And that was basically the only thing that shot 4K with the flip screen. Now the market's a little bit spicier. Sony seems to be adding flip screens and better ergonomics to their cameras, and they're really catching up to where Canon is at. But right now I think the RF mount is certainly the most interesting mount in all of the camera lineups. I'm very interested in seeing how this upgrade path works. We're already seeing rumors of these mirrorless RF mount cinema cameras. That could be very, very interesting for someone who does get something like this, and then you can just upgrade to that C200R when it comes out. Again, these are the reasons why I did invest into the RF mount. Now, I've been with the E mount for a long, long time, and I love the budget options of the E mount. I love those third-party lenses of the E mount. But now in the modern mirrorless era, we're seeing Canon shift all their bodies to this mirrorless RF mount, and it just seems more exciting, especially at that lower sort of budget cinema level. So for someone like myself, this has been an absolute pleasure to use, and I just can't wait to see what the future is like. So if I were to take all of that information and kind of sum it down into a score, I'm going to give this camera a 4 out of 5. I think it could absolutely be a 5 out of 5 perfect camera. The perfect camera, the camera that everyone wants, as long as they fix the overheating issues in the 4K HQ. But as it is, I like that 4K file just the way it is. I like that 10-bit. I love the IBIS. I love the RF mount so far. I love the ergonomics of the camera. I love all of the photography features of the camera. It does everything else perfectly. All right, that's it. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please leave a like and also subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. Don't forget to head over to the link down in the description to check out the full written article on this review. And make sure you head over to my Twitter at NoLifeDigital. Thanks for all the support, everyone. It's been awesome. Hopefully you learned something. Hopefully you took something away from all these videos. But it's been a blast. I'll catch you guys later. Peace, peace. Wait. You might be asking yourself, why didn't he talk about the 8K? Well, because it's pretty stupid. You get maybe 5 to 10 minutes of recording of a file that's basically impossible to work with. Until there's some sort of raw output from the HDMI on this camera, it's basically useless. I shot this footage here. I was shooting about an hour, some photos, some 4K 60, some 4K HQ, and then I was like, let me play around with this 8K, and I shot this footage here, and I got maybe a couple minutes of this wall before the camera overheated and basically locked me out for an hour. So don't use the 8K at all. It's not worth it. It's really not. It's really best when you want to capture those 8K images out of the camera. I just don't recommend anyone even going into that mode unless, you know, you really need a couple minutes of a shot where you're going to crop in on different angles, and don't rely on it. All right, anyways, that's enough. Bye-bye.